A question for young Earth creationists. Were rabbits and deer created with eyes in the front rather than on the side of their heads? Let's explore why we would ask that question and what possible responses are available to young Earth creationists in this episode of what I will call Consequences of young Earth thinking. A central tenet of young Earth creationism is the belief that the entire world before Adam's transgression experienced no animal death. What would such a world have looked like? Examining artist depictions of the Garden of Eden throughout the centuries, such as this 19th century depiction by painter John Wenzel Peter, and many young Earth creationist depictions of Eden, you would think that the animals looked like those alive today. Except the latter also, of course, believed that all extinct things, such as dinosaurs, were also alive at the same time as Adam and Eve. But do these depictions of this paradisical world of animals living in harmony, does this depiction of this perfect paradise really make sense? Ken Ham, founder and creator of the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter, loves to point out that the bathtub arks falsely depict the reality of Noah's Ark. But is Answers in Genesis' depiction of the Prelapsarian world, that is, the world before Adam's sin, really any more realistic than a bathtub ark? Here's a photo I took while attending a talk given by Answers in Genesis speaker Brian Osborne. Here dinosaurs have no fear in the Garden of Eden, and we see other familiar animals to us hanging out with Adam in this blissful, perfect paradise. Young Earth creationists frequently write about the original created kinds as having incredible amounts of variation that was used by natural selection to create different species. But these are the types of pictures they show in presentations. Notice that the monkeys, the deer, the birds look just like those that exist today. Also realize that their traits that they possess are adaptations to a world of mate competition, death, and protection from the environment. We might ask a young Earth creationist who thinks that the world was a perfect paradise in the beginning, what purpose did such traits as claws, thick and spiny skin, very sensitive hearing, eyes on the side of the head, serve in a world with no death? Let's ask some questions about the original creation prior to Adam's fall in the minds of young Earth creationists. First, did the Prelapsarian world contain maladaptations designed to be future adaptations? What is that you're saying? Okay. Did the young Earth creationist perfect world of Eden in which Adam and Eve lived include animals that had unnecessary characteristics before Adam's sin fundamentally altered the world's ecology? Okay, let's try to be more specific and ask this question. Did rabbits have forward-facing eyes before Adam's sin caused death to enter the world, rather than eyes on the side of the head, which are clearly adapted for avoiding predators? Not to even mention the form of their ears, which seem to be also a predator, avoidance mechanism. So could animals such as this rabbit originally have had eyes in front of their heads? I found myself asking these questions after I saw a series of photoshopped images circulating on social media a few years ago. The images show animals as we might expect them to look if they had no fear of being eaten. Ask yourself, why do animals that are frequently preyed upon by other animals have eyes on the sides of their heads? Functionally, they need better peripheral vision, whereas the predator has its eyes in the front since it doesn't need to be looking out for danger as much. Forward-facing eyes allow for binocular vision. All things being equal, in a world without predation, forward-looking eyes, assuming there were just two of them, would seem to have been the best design. But most animals have eyes toward the sides of their heads, impairing their ability to judge long distances with the trade-off of being able to see more of their surroundings at all times. I took this photo of a jackrabbit in the Bighorn Basin desert of Wyoming a few years back. The ears, the eyes, the fur color, they're fantastic adaptations to survival in a place where red foxes and coyotes are common. Would such adaptations, or designs if you prefer that terminology, be found in the world before Adam sinned, the Prelapsarian world? Claws, sharp teeth, thick hides, cryptic coloration patterns, exceptional hearing and eyesight, the ability to run very fast, etc., are all traits that serve an obvious function: to allow an animal to capture another or to avoid being captured. But in the perfect paradise model of the original creation that many young earth creationists espouse, these characteristics could not serve those functions and would be functionless, since no animal could die or could have been responsible for the death of another animal. In such a perfect paradise, the majority of morphological and behavioral traits that we observe in animals today would be characterized as maladaptations to their environment. So, what is a maladaptation? It's a trait that is more harmful than helpful. In contrast, an adaptation is a trait that is more helpful than harmful for an individual's survival and reproduction. In other words, their fitness in a particular environment. Usually, maladaptive traits begin as traits that were adaptations to their particular environment, but over time became less suitable or even problematic for an organism as their environment changes. Let's take a simple example. Moa birds are extinct flightless birds that used to live in New Zealand. But the last species went extinct about 700 years ago. In this image from 1870, or depiction from 1870 of a variety of different moa, for one thing, you can see how large they are. Notice the person on the left-hand side. These birds have no wings at all. All right, they lack wings altogether, but they're clearly a type of bird. It is not difficult to understand that their lack of flight and increased size compared to flighted animals were adaptations that improved their survival on an island in which there are little or few or no predators. Many islands have flightless birds because the advantages outweigh the disadvantages of flight. And we would say that flightlessness is an adaptation in that particular environment. However, when a certain predator, humans, arrived, the very traits that at one time were beneficial or adaptive to those species now become a serious liability. They become maladaptations that result in their being hunted to extinction. Nearly every trait of any organism has the capacity to become a maladaptation if the environmental conditions change over time. All species have traits that are less than perfectly fit for their current environment, that were sculpted for use in a slightly or highly different environment in the species past. Put in the context of a perfect paradise as conceived by the young earth creationists, where animals had no fear of one another, what would be the features we would expect to find in these animals? We would expect to have animals with no innate fears of humans or other animals. They would have no need of being very fast. They would not need weapons to defend themselves against each other or other animals. They would not need traits that we associate with sexual selection because they would not have to compete for mates, presumably. Fitness to this perfect environment would either result from characters adapted to life without fear or death at all, or all characters would simply be non-adaptive or random or seemingly random because they were of no consequence for their survival, since survival was not in question. However, once Adam brought death into the world in the young earth creationist scenario, and presumably set off the process of natural selection, all right, put it into motion, all these features would suddenly become what? Maladaptive in a sin-laden world. Although I have to say, I find it almost impossible to conceive of an ecology of living things where natural selection is not functioning at all. On the other hand, if animals had been created with thick hides, large muscles for fighting and running, and horns, these would have been maladaptations before animals could experience death, because these characters, they require energy to maintain and to produce. Whereas an animal not making these defenses would have more energy for reproduction. That sounds like natural selection going on, doesn't it? Natural selection in a world without death. Remember, the command is to multiply and fill the world. But if one animal is using a huge amount of energy and resources to produce defensive structures that aren't even needed, and other individuals in that same population don't spend any resources on those defensive structures, they're going to have more energy to reproduce, which hence they're going to make more offspring. And all the characteristics for protection eventually are going to disappear over many generations because they aren't producing as many offspring. But this is natural selection in the Garden of Eden. But that's another topic for another time. Let's return to our initial inquiry. Why do all animals in the rabbit family all have eyes on the sides of their heads, when a better design for finding food and just better eyesight generally would have their eyes in front so they could have better depth perception? Let's talk about some of the possible, I'll call them ad hoc solutions to this puzzle that young Earth creationists could propose. Just because, all right, God simply made some animals with eyes on the sides of their heads for his good pleasure. The characteristics that an animal had in the original creation may have played little or no function, but were rather there to display variation for God's own pleasure. From our human perspective, the eyes probably functioned to see, though I suppose it's possible that God could have made eyes that didn't see in the original creation, but then granted sight after sin changed them. And for each animal, there's no apparent, or at least to us, reason for their particular anatomical location. They could have had eyes on any portion of their body, and they presumably would have functioned well, and they would have survived because there was no death. A second possible solution: maybe traits had different adaptive uses before sin. So rather than just characters for being characters for God's good pleasure, maybe they have an adaptive use that's different than what we have today. So young Earth creationists, some of them seek to find an adaptive purpose for the characteristics of animals in the garden. When faced with sharp teeth, like dinosaur teeth, and feline teeth, some young Earth creationists have claimed that in the original creation, these teeth were used to eat plants. And only after death was it possible that they began using their teeth for eating flesh. For example, here's a photo of a page from Ken Ham's Dinosaurs in Eden book, published in 2000, so now more than 20 years old. Here we can see Tyrannosaurus-like dinosaurs with small arms and sharp teeth enjoying a diet of flowering plants and fruits. Notice that there are two primates also in this picture that look very much like the primate species today, and the plants are also easily recognizable, suggesting a Prelapsarian world in which the animals and plants were the same species, or at least had the same appearances as they have today. This runs contrary to the image painted by Answers in Genesis writers today, as we will see in just a moment. Option number 3. Traits were pre-adapted or predestined for future use. He made the animals with eyes on the sides of their head foreknowing that Adam would sin, and these animals were predestined to be prey, while other animals, such as eagles, were given great sight and large claws, knowing they would be predators in the post-Adamic ecology, or what we call the post-Lapsarian world. This is a form of Calvinistic superlapsarianism, as opposed to infralapsarianism, which is, for most creationists, for the creation. We could extend this to other characteristics, such as piercing teeth, large claws, and even internal digestive tract that works most efficiently while eating flesh rather than plants. These characteristics would not have any adaptive value in the original creation. But God knew the creation would only last just a couple days, right? After 6 days, many creationists believe that Adam sinned on the 6th day, if not the 7th day or the day after. And so this original creation, this original perfect paradise, would not exist very long. God knew that it wouldn't exist very long, and therefore just created the organisms ready to go for that post-paradisical world. And so he created these radical differences as adaptations that would find a use later. Number 4, pre-programmed variation allows for future adaptation to new environments. Now, this is an idea that's growing in popularity in young Earth creationist circles. The idea is that God built or pre-installed tremendous genetic variation into the original kinds that, although it might not have served any function in the original created state, in other words, a lot of the variants that he created didn't have a functional use in that original created state. They would later be subject to selection. Those variants would be subject to natural selection, allowing animals to adapt to their new ecological condition, in other words, the post-Lapsarian world. Much of this morphological variation has been hidden in the original kinds and then suddenly appears after Adam's sin, changing the world. So, for example, maybe eagles didn't have talons, but rather pigeon-like, feet. And new genetic combinations then created talons later. But some of the variation could have been displayed, right away. Maybe there were deer with dozens of color patterns, leg lengths, and abilities to jump. Some of them might have had eyes on the front or the sides of their head and had invisible, small, or big ears. Then, after the fall, most of the characteristics were quickly found to be maladapted in this new ecology. In other words, they didn't function for the survival of that organism. And only the characteristics that worked, or we'd say in our language, we'd say have higher fitness, were preserved in the features we see today. Young Earth creationists appeal to this creation of massive genetic diversity or potential planted in the original kinds. But I'm hard-pressed to find any description or speculation in their literature about what animals with such enormous variation would have actually looked like. Like, how was it physically expressed in the original creation compared to the presumably genetically depauperate ancestors we have today, all right? All the drawings of Edenic animals that I have seen in Young Earth creationists show animals that look like species alive today, as just we saw. Was that genetic variation expressed in many different individuals, or was it contained in every member of the original creation? It doesn't really matter, since Young Earth creationists believe that massive variation can be held in just a pair of animals preserved on Noah's Ark. That would suggest that they believe that such variation can be contained in a single animal, only be split out among many species in its descendants. I've shown how unrealistic this is in my past articles on my blog, thenaturalhistorian.com. For example, in this article, I write about young Earth creationist ideas about potential diversification of ruminant animals from a single common ancestor or pair through the bottleneck on Noah's Ark. Pushing this last idea to its, we'll call it its absurd end, we might imagine the original rabbit kinds had lots of genetic variations for head morphology. Maybe some individuals had eyes in the front, others on the side, or others toward the back, or maybe on the top of the head. It's also possible that some rabbits originally had eyes on other parts of their bodies. After all, were we there to see them? No, we weren't. No morphological condition could be measured in any way as better than another for survival, because survival wasn't a concern. All rabbits would survive. Hence, it's hard to without seeing them, be able to predict what they would look like, since you would have no feel for what a useful characteristic would be in that original ecology. Presumably, even competition for mates would not have happened either, since that would result in sexual selection of characteristics. Appearance could only have been measured aesthetically, not functionally. After Adam's sin brought death into the world, and the process of natural selection began to operate, the animals with traits that worked well for killing became predators, while others became those that were killed. For rabbits, preserving traits that help avoid being eaten were the most important, and thus they became prey and adapted for surviving in a predator-filled world. This natural selection, which presumably, I guess, didn't happen in the original Edenic ecology, would have selected prey animals with eyes on the sides of their heads, as other configurations wouldn't be fit for this new environment. Likewise, the original rabbits may have had 10 different types of ears, and some had long legs and short legs. But selection of the original variation quickly sorted out the various traits, leaving the animals with adaptations best fit for their new role in the environment as prey. To sum it all up, to anyone who has spent time studying biology and has measured fitness on traits in relationship to the environment, the scenarios above sound utterly fantastic and absurd. But these are the scenarios that young Earth creationists are compelled to put forward, because they have committed to a particular interpretation of Genesis that requires that the whole Earth was a perfect paradise. and that sin physically disrupted and radically altered organisms that God had made. Should not the fact that these things don't make any biological sense at all be some sort of signs that there's something amiss in their theology? And at least require a little bit of introspection about whether they might be misinterpreting Scripture? I think so. The perfect paradise that young earth creationists hold in their minds makes no sense, either biologically or theologically. This strange world that young earth creationists imagine has little relationship to the one described throughout the Bible. I'll have a lot more to say about this prelapsarian world that we have created in our own eyes rather than through Scripture in future presentations. For now, thanks for watching. Have a blessed day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.